Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to our webinar from wherever you take place. My name is Heike Schön, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar on the topic Key Performance Indicators, your key to successful clinical trial oversight. Before we move into the topic, I would like to give you some let's say housekeeping rules, your online housekeeping rules. At first, this webinar will be recorded and the presentation will be available on demand. You will receive a link tomorrow where you can download the presentation if you want. We will have throughout this webinar, we will have 3 polls where we ask you a question which you can answer immediately and we can jointly look at the outcome. And at the end of our webinar, we will have 15 minutes for question and answer session. So if you would like to present your questions, just type them in the question box. And also at the end, we would like to ask you to stay online because we have prepared a very short 3-question survey, as we would always like to have your feedback. So now I will present to you who we are, Lumis Life Science Consulting. Lumis Life Science Consulting is a company, Lumis Life Science Consulting, of course, is a company providing consulting and tailored solutions to the biopharmaceutical and medical device industry. We have a focus on developing together with our clients a clinical outsourcing strategy. We do the vendor selection and also develop tools for vendor management. Another part is the specialization in clinical and quality oversight when conducting clinical trials. And as it sometimes can happen, we are involved in for conflict resolution during the sponsor vendor critical aspects if they might come up. So with these services, we hope we can really accelerate your clinical project. But I'm not talking alone today, so I would also like to introduce the speakers for us today. So it's my pleasure. As the second speaker, we will have Christiane Juhls. She is a project director of Lumis Life Science Consulting, and she will walk you through the KPIs from a risk-based management perspective. And also my very high pleasure is to have Nancy Meyerson-Hess with us. She's our consultant, and she will share her experience in defining and implementing key quality indicators. And myself, Heike Schön, I'm the managing director of Lumis Life Science Consulting, and I will give you a short introduction into the background and importance of KPIs for your clinical projects. Here is our agenda for today. So first of all, a short introduction, then Christiane will walk you through the development of KPIs. Nancy will talk about the quality indicators in clinical trials, and we will have a final roundup after around 45 minutes so that we can have 15 minutes for question and answers. And again, just a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and available. So I will start now with the introduction on the concept of KPIs. And to start with it, I would like to use a definition of KPIs. I like always to start with a general definition, not only in clinical and drug development, but a general. So we took here the Cambridge Dictionary, which says that KPIs are a way of measuring a company's progress towards the goal it is trying to achieve. So a KPI is a performance metrics for a specific business activity. And it provides managers with advanced warning signals that there may be problems ahead. So therefore, key performance indicators are very important indicators because they show that something could happen in which situation or is likely or how it is changing to happen. It shows how well an economy, company, stock, project, etc. is doing. Summarizing, a KPI should indicate what action needs to take place. With this definition, we will move into our first poll. So our first question is, Has your organization already implemented key performance indicators? So please answer now. You have 1 minute. Okay, great. Thanks a lot for your participation. So we can see that we have 66% of our participants have already experience with implementing key performance indicators, 25% do not have, and 10% are not aware whether key performance indicators are used. I think this is a very nice distribution, and which I hope will also result in a good question and answer session later on. So, but now let's have a look into the key performance indicators to be used in clinical trials. Why do we use key performance indicators there? Clinical trials have a huge complexity, and that can cause delays if not measured proactively and regularly. It is, of course, always our goal to avoid delays in clinical trial performance, because any kind of delays has a strong impact on budget. It has a strong impact on the success measurements through your stakeholders, especially for sponsors. When, for example, you have a first-in-human clinical trial, it's delayed, but financing depends on the outcome. And of course, overall, it has an impact on the time to market, which is critical, and especially if you are developing a compound to be first in class. So it is all of our intention to avoid these kind of delays. And this can be done by using clinical key performance indicators. And there's also, of course, a regulatory background given. The ICH GCP E6 in its second revision provides a very good basis for clinical trial oversight management. And it is especially also focusing on to give sponsors the possibility to align with their CROs, vendors, and subcontractors. Therefore, key performance indicators can be seen as a centerpiece to prevent issues from occurring. So, how to develop key performance indicators? We have always our magical triangle, which says what are the most important parts, but these are the quality of our clinical trial, the costs, and the timeliness of the performance of the clinical study. So KPIs should be developed in a very collaborative and transparent manner together with the CROs, vendors, and subcontractors, because the fourth part of the triangle is the relationship. And the closer the relationship is, the more transparent the development of KPIs, the alignment of KPIs, and the common understanding why to measure certain activities, timelines, costs, and quality. So this is very important. It has to be in a very collaborative and open, transparent way. So the measurement of key performance indicators is the basis, it's a metrics. So we have to develop measurements. From these measurements, you will develop your key performance indicators. So Christiane, in her presentation, will go into more details how this should be done. But these are the key point are really the measurements you have to select to develop your key performance indicators. For the development of the KPIs, we recommend to go through a very simple stage. First of all, you should ask yourself, what are your critical success factors of the project? And then you should define the related questions on the key performance to measure the critical success factors. And then you define and measure the metrics to answer these questions, which you will then do together with your CROs, your vendors, and subcontractors. So here the importance is really to stay focused and always consider the impact the key performance indicators have. And there is generally a tendency to implement too many KPIs. And suddenly you sit there and you're just overwhelmed with your own KPIs to analyze them and to understand them. This is not necessary if you focus on the importance and on the impact, because everything that can be measured must not be measured. So please stay focused and smart as this little owl below. Here are some examples, what kind of metrics you can measure during the study life cycle. If we take the three main parts, we have the clinical startup, clinical trial conduct, clinical trial closeout metrics. And for example, during the startup, you can measure the investigator recruitment, the progress of investigator recruitment, or first patient, first visit. Clinical trial conduct metrics. There, of course, the quality of the site performance is very important. Adherence to timelines, query resolution, trial master file documentation, completeness. And during the closeout, some metrics may include last patient, last visit, the database log timelines, time to close the sites. So these would be some examples. We will go further detail later on to measure, to develop, to use the metrics during the study life cycle. And here's an example which we have derived from the Tufts Center for the study of drug development. They made a little survey about 57 participants, which were all sponsors. And that was about what are the most frequently used KPIs for CRO performance. So that was one example. And one key KPI used were cycle time metrics. Of course, last patient, last visit to database log was seen as critical, and also study startup metrics. And if you take, for example, if you go down a little bit, there's another one, of course, around budget, final actual contract cost as a percent of initial contract value, which is, of course, important to track this ongoing and to measure the performance of the service provider. So this is just an example. And with this example, I would like to finish my short introduction on KPIs, and I will hand over to Christiane, and she will also present herself shortly, introduce herself before her presentation. So thank you very much. Next, Christiane, please.
Thank you, Heike, and hello to everyone. It's my pleasure to walk you today through the development of key performance indicators. Next, please. Yes, key performance indicators are closely related to risk management. And risk management is the base for this development. And I think all of you are familiar with risk in clinical trials. However, they are, of course, very different from the risks that are shown in this picture. But sometimes you may feel that you have a similar situation. And to start off, I would like to know if your organization applies already risk-based management in clinical trials. We have here our second poll. And again, we would like to ask you to respond to our question within the next minutes so that we can look jointly to the results. Thank you very much for participating in this poll. We have a very interesting result. Many of you already use or have implemented risk-based management in your organization. Some of you plan. And from here, I think it's a good idea to start with the general risk management process. In the next slide, please. Just for an overview and to start all of the same place. I don't see the next slide yet. So anyway, I will start on the general risk management process. The first step is already the identification of risks by answering the question, what might go wrong in my clinical trial? After you have answered that, you may end up with a big number of risks, and these have to be assessed to be reduced in their number. Assessment involves the two questions: what is the likelihood it will go wrong, and what is the impact of my risks? And only risks that are very likely to occur and have a high impact on your clinical trial can be referred to as critical risks. And these are the risks we need to focus on in relation to the key performance indicators. The next step is control and mitigation of risks by answering the question, what will we do and at which point? But this is not all. Also communication, as Heike already mentioned, is crucial here, because you cannot really mitigate risks if not everyone involved has understood the risk or has not been informed. Then, after the risk may have occurred and you have mitigated it already, then you have to review the result of this by answering the question, are the critical risks mitigated successfully? Hopefully they are, and this appears then in your report, which is very, very interesting for inspectors from regulatory authorities. So this helps you also to be inspection ready, because you then should ideally say, yes, I have recorded the occurred risks sufficiently and interpreted their impact correctly and was able to do the best I could achieve. Today, next, please. We will focus on this aspect, which is control and mitigation, because key performance indicators are actually a tool that tells you what will I do and at which point, or what will you do, what will we do. Next, please. It all comes down to the point that you have to define what you expect and then measure what you have achieved. Measurement brings us to metrics again. And metrics are single measures, and they should be relevant, actionable, accessible, and accurate. And with your risks that you have identified as being critical, you can select and consolidate the right metrics and turn them into key performance indicators. The result of this process is that you have high-level metrics which enable you to assess the performance of a clinical trial, and that's rather related to budget, time, and quality, especially against your objective in this specific area. Next. So once you have your KPIs planned, you would like to develop them in more detail, and for that, you need a baseline. And this baseline is actually already in your project plan, and if not, the project plan may be a little bit more detailed. Your project plan usually contains also milestones and intermediate objectives. And we have spoken before about the critical risks. They have been identified and assessed. So it all comes together with your clearly defined expectations for the critical deliverables. So what should the deliverable look like in terms of time, budget, and quality? From here, it shouldn't be so difficult anymore to select the most useful metrics to monitor the progress of the tasks that in the end should lead to a critical deliverable. And you merge the metrics when it's useful, and by that turn them into high-level metrics in the so-called key performance indicators. To work with them, you need thresholds, because actually you need to trigger an action based on the performance indicators. And the selection or the definition of the threshold is mostly done based on experience from previous trials or historic performance data, but sometimes you may also ask the literature references, because there are also publications on that. In the end, this also only is to give you the answer, what is going to give you the information you want. Next. So having defined and developed key performance indicators is not all. You also need to implement them. And for that, we need defined roles and responsibilities. Otherwise, it's very nice to have all this information available, but how to work with it, how to get it, this brings us to data sources, and how to distribute the information and turn it into action. So a clear and agreed communication plan here is very crucial, and this should fix the timing, regular and efficient transfer of the critical information. And if you do that early, it may be part of your contract. Actually, it's advisable to have it there, because then right from the start of the clinical trial, everyone knows what to report, when, to whom, and so on. The data that you receive, of course, have to be processed. And ideally, the processing tools are interactive and allow signal detection, ideally automatically, but on the other hand, nobody can replace a human being here, because someone has to interpret. We also need reporting rules and tools. Dashboards are very nice here. And not to forget feedback loops for adjustments, corrective and preventive actions, so-called KPIs. Next. In the first example I'm going to show you, we have a KPI selected that is related to cycle time. Here it's the risk of delayed patient enrollment that we would like to mitigate with the KPI called patient enrollment, very clear. And this KPI should give you the ability to project the overall enrollment time, indication of the milestone reachment, last patient in, and it serves also as an early indicator of deviation from the planned overall trial duration, and that is very, very important. Here we have an example where the enrollment of 100 patients within 4 months is the objective, and we will collect the data in a frequency of 2 weeks, so bi-weekly, from the status report of the clinical project manager. The data or the key performance indicator would be calculated as the ratio of the actual randomized to projected number of patients. Again, the question of the baseline here, where do I get it? I get it from the projection spreadsheets of the clinical sites. And I report this key performance indicator as percentage in a cumulative way. Thresholds for action are very useful if they are also displayed in an ample system with green, yellow, and red, as displayed here in the slide. And for this example, we've chosen 2 thresholds. One is 40%, one is 30%. And here, for example, if after 2 months, more than 40% of patients have been enrolled, there is no action required. However, if it's less than 40% after 2 months, there needs to be an explanation. And if it's less than 30% after 2 months, I would go out for root cause analysis and a kappa and initiate kappa if necessary. And in this case, after only less than 30% are there, it is definitely necessary. Next, please. The second example is related to budget. And here we have chosen the key performance indicator of monitoring costs. The risks is the increase, of course. And here we see that this KPI should help us to get information on the average monitoring cost per site as an indicator of the CRO and site performance. But moreover, it gives us also an early indication of budget deviations to be expected for the entire trial. Our objective here is, of course, to stay with the planned budget. And many of experienced clinical trial performers calculate with a maximum increase of 20%. The data sources here are the invoices that arrive at the finance department and the status reports of the clinical project manager, and the calculation of the KPI is done as a ratio of the actual versus the planned monitoring costs over all sites. The information is processed in percentage in a cumulative way. And again, we have here two thresholds, again highlighted in green, yellow, and red. For example, if you after a certain number of months you have a budget deviation from less than 10%, there is of course no action needed. But if, let's say, after half of the trial or right in the beginning, the planned budget exceeds 10%, 110% in this case, then there need to be explanation. And this budget increase may likely be related to more visits or more hours, and this again help us to understand whether or not there are problems at the site or with the monitoring itself. There are different possibilities, but usually or very often it's a problem at the site. Monitoring costs after a certain number of months that exceed already the 20% plus versus the planned costs definitely require action. And with that, next. I hope that I could show that metrics and KPIs are really indispensable when the progress and the performance of a clinical trial is followed. However, next, there shouldn't be too many in case you have already thought about very, very many metrics and KPIs that would be useful. And so I would like to hand over to Nancy, and thank you all for listening to my part.
Thank you, Christiane, very much. I'm Nancy Meyerson-Hess, and today I would like to focus on quality indicators in clinical trials. So as you've seen with the two other presentations we've had, we also have a poll for you. So if we could move on to this, we'd like you to consider the question, are you using quality indicators? And you have, again, about a minute to answer. Okay, and here you can see our results. So it's quite interesting. We've got just under half of you are using key quality indicators, but if you look toward it, it's most of the participants are either not using them or perhaps might not really be fully aware of key quality indicators. So let's move on then to the first slide. Now, I always like to use a cartoon to get us started. And here you can see a nice depiction of medication bottles. And I just would like you to think about why we're here today, because it's all about the outcome. And the outcome of what we're doing in clinical trials is that we produce a successful drug discovery. We develop that discovery successfully, and we provide the availability of a new treatment for patients. You've seen and heard through Heike and Christiane how key performance indicators are so critical to the clinical trial. And now I'm going to try to take you through a little bit about how to assure the quality part of your clinical trial. Next slide, please. So what is a quality indicator in a clinical trial? This really involves defining a clinical trial outcome, our goals, describing the target output as well. And here in particular, I like to look at indicates as a terminology. What indicates that this has actually been achieved or perhaps missed? This can be done through metrics, processes, controls, and we've seen this through the two previous presentations. And all of these rolled up together are useful in order to determine if our targeted quality level has been reached. Next slide, please. Now here you just see two very high-level components, very important in quality in clinical trials. Now, the first box you'll see contains ICH GCP, good clinical practice, which I'm sure probably most of you on the call are familiar with. Again, ICH GCP addresses the overall international ethical and quality standards used in designing, conducting, documenting, and reporting of clinical trials. So ICH GCP. We look toward quality by design in a more drug development from a beginning perspective of implementing robust processes, risk management, and controls. So the two are very tightly connected, and I haven't gone through other aspects of ICH as well. However, I just want to throw out a few terms which unfortunately today, due to time, we're not able to delve into. Items such as quality tolerance limits, also known as QTLs, which are very important and used in clinical trials, and it also has been embraced by ICH GCP in E6, R2, started in R2 as well. So I'd like to move on to the next slide, please. So here on this slide, you see some of what contributes to the overall quality of the clinical trial. As a comment, I have not included the actual medicinal product itself, nor the good manufacturing area involved in overall quality involved in clinical trials. So here, again, we're just talking about the clinical trial without GMP. In this short presentation, I've picked out one aspect to focus on, and I'd like you to look at the clinical trial protocol as an example for quality of the clinical trial. Now, on this slide, you'll see some other contributors to the clinical quality of the trial, and these will be clinical trial documentation, clinical trial resources, clinical trial data, and of course, patient safety. But we will not have time today to look into these other components as well. Next slide, please. So let's go down to the basics of the clinical trial protocol. Does the clinical trial protocol actually reflect the goal of the trial, which will have to do with the indication and or the medicinal product, which is based upon scientific and or medical approaches and expectations? So how does one go about really trying to confirm that the clinical trial protocol does reflect the goal? Well, one way is to have experts review and assess the clinical trial protocol early on in the beginning, together with recommendations, perhaps for revisions, which will support the overall quality of the clinical trial protocol from the beginning on. And obviously, the goal is to have a fit for purpose protocol. Next slide, please. So we have our clinical trial protocol, but now we are confronted with compliance with the clinical trial protocol. Compliance with the trial protocol and protocol deviations are key, absolutely key to the quality of the clinical trial. So what can we do in which to really get a focus on trial compliance to the protocol? Well, one is to define the quality goal of compliance with the protocol. And this means that it is absolutely imperative to set the scope of protocol deviations and the classification of the protocol deviations prior to starting the clinical trial. The number of deviations, things such as missed timelines, inclusion of patients not fulfilling inclusion criteria, will impact the quality of the clinical trial and consequently the statistical analysis and the clinical report. Next, please. Is the clinical trial protocol actually doable? And this is the big question. Does the protocol reflect suitable clinical and operational requirements for both sites and patients? When protocols are filled with requirements which are difficult or not possible for the patient or the site to complete, we see the overall compliance with the clinical trial protocol will be impacted. Involving site staff and patient experts in the creation of protocols, reviewing operational and logistical requirements very early on will support the overall quality of the clinical trial protocol and will reduce protocol non-compliance and also encourage patient retention in the clinical trial. So doability is very, very important to the overall quality of the clinical trial. Next, please. Here I would like to introduce an approach that I have seen working very nicely to overseeing the quality of a clinical trial. And here I call it the Quality Steering Committee, in that the Quality Steering Committee is charged with setting quality expectations and overseeing the outcome of the quality within a clinical trial. This committee should have stakeholders from all of the functional areas involved in the clinical trial. The committee should be one of the role models for, let's call it, quality culture, not just associated with the clinical trial. Obviously, as we heard earlier on today in the webinar, we need input from KPIs and KRIs, key risk indicators, which are instrumental to the assessment of the quality of the clinical trial. And finally, here in the last box, you'll see it's the output of the committee and any CAPAs which must be communicated to the clinical trial team and the organization as appropriate. Next, please. So here on this slide, I'd like to drill down further and look at some of the things that the committee needs to do, or options for the committee. The committee must set the goals, metrics, thresholds, and/or triggers for the review of the quality of the clinical trial. Additional approaches can be establishing a quality management plan for the clinical trial, assigning dedicated resources with roles and responsibilities for quality activities within the clinical trial as well. And very important remains the review of protocol and SOP deviations, as well as the outcome and actions from other activities such as inspections, audits, and/or co-monitoring. And finally, yes, of course, the CAPA situation is absolutely critical in order to undertake any revisions or changes that need to be made. Next slide, please. So in summary, just to think about, the quality in a clinical trial is imperative. We must have quality. Quality must be at the forefront of the clinical trial. What else do we need? We need to set up, I recommend here, a quality steering committee for each clinical trial. This would be a committee to oversee the quality of the individual trial. Early input in things such as strategy and assessment of protocols, looking at operational approaches through involving sites and patients in order to reduce non-compliance, which will achieve the quality goals for that clinical trial. And finally, regular review of protocol and SOP deviations as indicators of the quality of the clinical trial. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to Christiane and Nancy for your presentations. And so we have reached nearly the end of the presentations, but before I round up from the speakers and content, I would like to encourage you to ask questions and to enter your questions into the question session. We have received a couple already, so it would be nice if you would like to use this time now also to ask your question. So for the roundup, what we have heard is KPIs should be defined cooperatively and transparently between the sponsor and CRO. This is really the basis to make it a success, that they are developed jointly in full harmony and fully harmonized between the parties. You should be smart in choosing KPIs because everything that can be measured must not be measured. So you should not overmeasure. KPIs are a tool of risk-based clinical trial management, and they are a core manageable set of KPIs helps you to predict and assess achievement of your goals. So you should ensure that the information is flying from the source to the recipient. Agree on when, how, and to whom the information metrics will be provided. Performance and quality metrics together allow continuous assessment of the clinical trial if the clinical trial indicates any needs for changes. And, as Nancy pointed out, consider a quality steering committee for each clinical trial. Okay, so now we move to our Q&A session. Let's have a look at what questions came in so far. So one question was, how many KPIs are ideal to have? So Christiane, would you like to answer?
Yes, thank you, Heike, and thank you for the question. There is no real number that we can say here, because the number of KPIs in general depends on the complexity and the phase of the trial. Mostly we've seen, or it's advisable not to have more than 10 to 15 KPIs per trial. And it's always the question how many critical risks you have identified, and how relevant the information that you derive from the KPIs is really for corrective and preventive actions should the risk occur. So yeah, 10 to 15 would be my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then there's another question about thoughts on how to best link KPIs directly into milestone payments. Yeah, this is a question which often comes up, and I would say, first of all, the milestone payments are themselves a KPI because they are related to timely achievements and payment terms. But generally, we would also advise to link them to certain quality indicators. For example, the cleaning of certain percentage of the database, because, for example, you have a dose escalation study, then you need to have clean data before you can move to the next dose level. And these are very critical, timely critical factors. And of course, from the quality, depending that all the sites, the CRAs, everybody is working in line. And then to combine those payments to the milestone payments. This would be one example, but I think generally we would always advise to link KPIs into the contract, into the payments. So then we have another question, which is to Nancy. Our team is small. Do we really need to have people working on quality?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, we do, and some people also wear multiple hats. So I think that it's not imperative to have very large teams involved, but you do need to have a quality well defined, and someone needs to own it. So there are various scenarios depending upon the scope of the company and also the clinical trial or the project.
Yeah, thank you. And there's another question which could be answered by Christiane and Nancy, so you can both. How can KPI management be used as a tool to work with regulatory, production, and product development?
Oh, that's very complex. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I understood correctly. It's about the regulatory, and I think it refers to the inspection readiness also. So key performance indicators are part of the risk management, as I said, and you have with this high-level metrics a good opportunity also to show to inspectors and to regulators the progress or the experience of your with your vendors. But also we have only talked about leading KPIs today to steer the process, but there are also KPIs that you can afterwards measure and fix and use for the report. And I'm not sure whether I got all the parts of the question correctly. Heike, may you, can you help me here again?
No, I think it's fine. Thank you. I think it's the combination to work with regulatory production and product development to develop also jointly key performance indicators to move to the within the different stages.
Yeah.
So another question is, if CRO has its own KPIs, is it recommendable for the sponsor to adapt them, or is it better to develop a brand new set of KPIs? I think this is also a very good question, because here we should really avoid the duplication of efforts. So I think if the CRO has very good KPIs which fit into your overall objectives of what you want, what are your critical success factors, then you should use them. You don't need to reinvent the wheel always. But sometimes CROs have their own KPIs which might not completely reflect your intention and your objective. Then of course you should develop maybe additional KPIs together with the CRO, based, for example, on using their tools, their data management, their CTMS. So I think it always can be a good combination to avoid too many development efforts on KPIs. So then there's another question, I think for Nancy. You mentioned quality culture in your presentation. How does that work within an organization?
Oh, that's also good. We're getting such good questions. It's a known phenomenon when you're talking, all of us use the word quality in everything that we do in clinical research, and especially in clinical trials. But it's very, very important that it comes from the top down, actually, a quality culture. It means embracing the importance of, as we heard, compliance and setting actual goals and thresholds and oversight of those in order to maintain the deliverables that the organization or the company has. And you know, I think it's easy to say, but it does take effort to establish a quality culture for the entire organization.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And I think the next question is also for you. Who comprises the quality steering committee? For example, data management, biostatistics, is a question mark. Who comprises the quality steering committee?
Yeah, you know, this really depends on the scope of the trial or the project. It can be quite a large group of people. If there's data management involved, it can be data management. It can be, it's very classical that it is from each of the functional groups involved in, I call it a trial, but you can also extend it to drug development scenarios. You could use it just for regulatory. It's really the type of oversight of what is going on in your project. Is it meeting the goals and the thresholds and the metrics that this team has set? So it's oversight of the project with makeup of functional groups. And it can be, especially in an outsourced scenario, that the members of the quality, I'll call it steering committee, are members from the vendor or from the, for instance, the CRO, if they are responsible for a particular functional aspect of the project. So it's very flexible. There is no one size fits all.
Okay, thank you. So then there's one question. Why do you believe that last patient, last visit to database log is the most important KPI for CRO performance? Okay, thank you. For this question, there seems to be more a misunderstanding. That was an example given, which was collected by the Tufts Institute. I think it's not the most important KPI for CRO performance, but it's generally a very important KPI because this shows how fast things will happen. That means how fast can the database be logged from the last patient out. And these are always critical factors because you want to have the data as clean as possible before the last patient last visit has been performed overall in your clinical trial, so that you can really keep a very short time frame to database log, to move into statistical analysis and to prepare your report. So these are important aspects also to review on the CRO performance, but to review also the site performance, the quality of the site. And for the sponsor, of course, it is important to close the study as fast as possible to publish the results. So I would say it's not the most important KPI. Maybe that was a misunderstanding, but it is an important KPI. Okay, so what else do we have in questions here? Yeah, one is how often should the KPIs be reviewed? Christiane, would you like to take this over?
Yes, I can take this over. And again, this depends on your trial actually and the complexity. So for example, if you have a phase 1 trial, which is very short, you will have a higher frequency of review. But if you have a very long-lasting trial with very little number of patients recruited over time, and not such a dynamic trial, then the frequency may be lower. So this is not something that you can review regularly and say regularly. And the risks that are associated to your KPIs actually tell you how often you can review them, because you know when you expect the risk to occur or at which time point the likelihood is very high that it occurs, and this should be linked to the review frequency. That would be my answer. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. And one last question, it's a long question. Data sources for KPIs are often fragmented and need to be aggregated to get a true picture of the status. Do you have approaches or tools that you have good experience with to work effectively with the information that are the basis for KPIs? Yeah, this is a very good point, and it's definitely also one weakness in working with measures that can be fragmented. However, what we are always trying to do is really to use a lot through the data management systems and also through the CTMS systems from the CROs. So there, and of course, the idea would be to have this as a integrated dashboard, but this is always a technical part of development, which can be handled by some companies, and by some companies it can't. But I totally agree, this is a critical point. And I hope that also with the increasing digitalization of clinical trials, that we would get a much easier approach to obtain sources for measuring the clinical key performance indicators. Okay, so I think by that time being, we need to stop our question and answer session. Thanks a lot for sending over your questions. And I hope we could sufficiently answer them or give some further ideas to it. And I would like to thank the speakers for today, Nancy and Christiane, for their participation. And we all would like to thank you for joining our webinar. Today, we hope it was an interesting topic for you, and that you will join us on further webinars. Please check on our website, but you will anyway also get information on LinkedIn and email invitations for the upcoming webinars. So you connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, of course, and we look forward also to have you on one of our next events. So herewith, I will close the webinar, and please, after closing, stay online to participate in our very short survey. Thank you very much and have a nice day.